Today we're going to talk about measuring in the kitchen. And the reason why we focus so much on measuring is because it's a very important skill if you want to be able to follow recipes accurately. So when you measure, you'll be using one of these pieces of equipment. You have a scale, you have a measuring pitcher, you have measuring cups, and you have measuring spoons. And you also have a knife to help you out. The first measuring device that I want to talk about using with you is the measuring spoons. And measuring spoons are a great measurement piece of equipment for small ingredients. If you have a little amount of anything and you want to measure it, it's probably going to be measured in spoons. It can be a liquid, can be measured in spoons. It can be a sticky ingredient or an ingredient that is has more of a texture to it, and it can also be a dry ingredient, but they're really only going to be used for small amounts. And the other thing that spoons have is they have two different sizes, and those sizes are written on it. They have tablespoons and they have teaspoons. And the thing about spoons and recipes is that most who are following a recipe, if they make a mistake, they've made a mistake because they mix up or they switch up tablespoons and teaspoons, or they struggle with their fractions. So if you're struggling in math with your fractions, but you want to be a good chef, you're definitely going to want to study harder, because those fractions are going to become important to you as you're working in the kitchen. So if you take a look here at this chart, you'll see that chefs, they're lazy just like you and I, and when they write a recipe, they abbreviate. And so when they're abbreviating a tablespoon, it's the large T, a B, and an S. But if they're abbreviating for a teaspoon, it's a small t, an S, and a P. And the other way that I like to remember it is that a tablespoon, whether it be a half tablespoon or a full tablespoon, they're large. They're the largest. They're like a table. They're big. They're something that you can sit at, right? But teaspoons are going to be much smaller. And you know that tea is something that you would be drinking out of a cup, which would be smaller than a table. So if you think a cup of tea or a table, which one's larger? Tablespoons are always going to be larger than teaspoons. Okay, when we are measuring with spoons, I wanted to go ahead and give you some examples of some things that you might measure with spoons and how to do it to the best of your ability. So when you're measuring, you always want to have a bowl in which you're putting your ingredients in. This could be your mixing bowl if you're baking, or it could just be a bowl that you're going to contain those ingredients in while you're making your recipe. But you don't want to measure directly from the bag or container it comes from into your recipe. You always want to keep those separate. Have everything ready on the side. Get everything ready before you actually mix things together. So if this was our mixing bowl, if this was going to be our bowl that we were going to put things in, let's say we were going to measure flour. One of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to pour the flour over the mixing bowl. That would be a mistake. If we pour too much flour out into the mixing bowl, we're never going to have an accurate recipe. And if there's other ingredients already in this bowl, then that's going to make us have to start over. So, if this is the bowl that you're going to put the ingredients in, what you want to do is you put this off to the side. If this is the container that you have your ingredient in, flour is a perfect dry ingredient to talk about. What you want to do is you want to take more than you need. Okay? When you take more than you need, you then take the knife and you come across the top of the knife with the flat edge, and you take exactly the top off so it's nice and flat. Alright? Now you can take this over to your mixing bowl and you can go ahead and dump that in. Alright? And so that's how you would measure a dry ingredient with the spoons. If you were measuring an ingredient like sour cream, it's more of a wet, sticky ingredient. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get out as much of it as you can, and sometimes like butter and things you'll want to pack down in there. You want to make sure that you have it all, and then you're going to want to make sure that you get all of it off the edges so nothing extra falls in. This is exactly a half a tablespoon of sour cream. So if our recipe was calling for a half a tablespoon of sour cream, when we put it into our bowl, we want to make sure that we get all of the sour cream out and not leave some in, because it didn't call for something like a tablespoon, it called for exactly a tablespoon. So you want to get all of those ingredients into your mixing bowl if you can. And then lastly, when you're measuring with a liquid, and here I have apple cider vinegar, you can also measure liquids in a measurement of spoons, but don't pour it over top of the mixing bowl, okay? Take your mixing bowl, put it off to the side, and then go ahead and measure till it's just about to overflow. Bring it over, then mix it in, okay? And technically I should have had a towel down or a cup or something, but this is now our bowl. We know that the accurate measurements are in here, and we can go ahead and move on to our next ingredients. The next measuring device that you'll find that you use a lot in the kitchen is measuring cups. And measuring cups are great for large amounts. They aren't in two different measurements, so that's good news. You can't mix that up. But what you can mix up is your fractions. So once again, study hard in math so that way you know your fractions and you can use them well in the kitchen, because they become very important when you're measuring. Most students I've seen make mistakes with measuring cups will do one of two things. Most often, they will measure fractions improperly. They won't use the right fraction for what the recipe calls for. The other mistake they make is that they try to measure liquids in measuring cups. And measuring cups aren't designed for measuring liquids, and we'll explain that later when talking about measuring pitchers. But they're actually good for measuring dry ingredients and sticky ingredients, but not wet ingredients. So next we're going to show you how to use measuring cups. Just like when measuring with the spoons, when you're measuring with cups, you always want to have your bowl for your ingredients, and you never want to measure over top of the bowl. You always want to measure over top of whatever ingredient you're getting out of its container. And that's so that if any falls, it falls back into the container and not into your mixing bowl. Remember, dry ingredients are great for being measured with cups, so let's show you how to do that. This is a third cup. This is flour. What I want to do is I dig into the flour and I take more than I need. Alright, and then what I do is I use my knife and I tap on the side to get rid of any air pockets that I might find inside. And then last but not least, I go ahead and take that knife and I come right across the top. So now I've measured exactly a third cup. I can bring my mixing bowl over to it and I can dump that third cup right in. That's how you measure a dry ingredient. When you're measuring a sticky ingredient, never a wet ingredient, but a sticky ingredient, this might be a bit trickier. And you'll have to try to kind of figure out how you want to make this work. But what you want to do is you want to go ahead and get the ingredients into the container. This one's going to be close, but hopefully we did it. Now, I tried to take as much as I could. I pack it down in there, come across the top, make sure there's no air pockets, make sure I'm only taking exactly a fourth cup if that's what the recipe calls for. Get all of the rest of it scraped off and back into the container. And now when I put it into my mixing bowl, I want to make sure that when I put it into my mixing bowl, I get everything out. Don't leave it like this, because now the recipe doesn't have a fourth cup of sour cream in it. You want to make sure that you get as much of it out of the measuring cup as possible. So this is better than when we started. Next, we're going to talk about measuring pitchers. And the only reason why I have two different ones up here is to show you that measuring pitchers come in different sizes. This one here is for 2 cups or less, and this one here is for a cup of less or less. And it also comes in different measurements as well, and that'll just depend on the recipe and what it calls for. As you can see here, this can be on ounces or cups, and then on the other side you can see how it's measured in milliliters as well. So a lot of different uses for measurement, but it's all measured for liquids. This is a liquid measuring pitcher. Whether you get the smaller one or the larger one, you're going to want to measure liquids in this. And in order to be accurate with this, you're going to have to think back to science class. And in science class, when you were using beakers and you were measuring liquids in those beakers, remember that you wanted to take the measurement at its lowest point, because liquids don't lay flat. And that's one of the reasons why measuring cups don't work for liquids. If you take the lowest point in the liquid, it's actually pulled up on the sides, and you couldn't measure that accurately in a cup, in a measuring cup, because it would have to be constantly overflowing the edges of the cup in order to get the right measurement. So a measuring cup's going to always give you a little bit less than a measuring pitcher is going to give you. I'll help you by showing you how this works. So let's say that our recipe calls for a half a cup of apple cider. This would be our best measuring device. And when I pour the apple cider into the measuring cup, the biggest mistake that I see people make is that they will take that measuring cup and they will hold it. And when they hold it, they will tilt it one way or the other. And if I hold this to the camera, you can see that I can make this look like less than, or I can make it look like more than the actual ingredient in here. So the best thing to do is go ahead and set that down on a flat surface. And when you set it down on a flat surface, that's when it's going to read for you. So if the recipe calls for half, that's pretty accurate. Let's get a little bit more in there. Now, when you look at this, this is almost exactly a half cup. And you can see how it pulls up around the edge. And so now you're ready to pour it into your mixing bowl or whatever container you're going to use for the recipe. But remember, flat surface, don't hold it in your hand. This is only for liquid ingredients. Okay, our last measuring equipment that we're going to talk about today, and that's common in the kitchen on a regular basis, is going to be the scale. And the scale is mainly used when you're talking about bulky ingredients. Let's say that a recipe calls for ground beef or for chicken. You might not be able to get that very well measured accurately in measuring cups, or it's not a liquid, so you wouldn't want to put it in measuring pitchers. So how do you figure out how much you need? And that's where scale comes into play. So you'll have scales just like this in your kitchen at school, and if you don't, hopefully you have some kind of scale at home as well. It's a very common tool, so let's talk about how to use it. The first thing you'll notice is that when I turn this on, it's set at zeros, and under its units it's pounds and ounces, and I can go ahead and change it to milliliters, to grams, to fluid ounces. But today we're going to talk about pounds and ounces. And so the first thing you'll notice is that when there's nothing on it and I zero it out, that means it's set at exactly 0. Anything I put on it will be measured. So now I take my mixing bowl and I put my mixing bowl on it, because that's what's going to hold my ingredients. And as you can see, my mixing bowl weighs 6.2 ounces. So I want to now zero it back out, because I don't want to measure my mixing bowl and my ingredients. I want to measure just my ingredients. So I hit the 0 button again, and now it goes back to 0. So now I know that anything I add to my mixing bowl will be accurate according to the recipe. Whereas if I put the mixing bowl on and didn't zero it out, that's the common mistake that some chefs make when they're first learning how to use a scale in the kitchen. So what I'll do is, let's say the recipe calls for 12 ounces of beans, and I'm going to just start adding beans, and the ounces should keep going up. And if I want 12, that's 12.1. All I need to now do is take some of those off. 11. And there we go. I have my 12 ounces of beans.